The booking agents for the TV news shows, the cable news shows, who put MPAC and CAIR spokespeople as representatives of the complete Muslim community.
You know, I think it's interesting that they allow groups like CAIR or MPAC or ISNA to basically drive, allowing them to put their message on the air on major networks such as CNN, Fox, and elsewhere without challenging them, without finding out whether there are other Muslims that disagree with them. And often when we ask to appear with them, those groups will cancel, and the networks will allow them to appear alone, unchallenged. And I think this is where there needs to be change. Nobody's saying to take away their free speech or not allow their ideas to be out there, but the time in which they're the only representatives of Muslims needs to go away, so that America sees there's ideological diversity within the Muslim community. And that's why we formed our American Islamic Leadership Coalition, which is to give a quick venue for bookers and others to know that there are other Muslims out there, rather than the Brotherhood front groups like CAIR and is the Islamic Society of North America.
Is it possible for non-Muslims to support these groups?
Absolutely. We will not succeed without the support of non-Muslim groups, because right now many Muslims that don't belong to these groups, the Islamist groups, aren't yet empowered enough to feel that they need to be a part of an Islamic group, and that's why they left the Islamist groups, is they don't want to be active based on Islamic identification. So the non-Muslims that get this need to help put pressure on Muslim groups to help build our institutions so that we can develop a momentum that will then bring Muslims on board.
What about people's innate fear of being thought of as racist for challenging another faith's theology?
I think it's absurd for somebody to say that if you question an ideology which is theopolitical, that mixes religion and politics into one, that's racism. Racism is something against skin color, against something that's immutable, and they're not criticizing a personal faith practice, but they're criticizing a political ideology that threatens constitutional republic, that threatens our way of system and our way of governance. So that's not bigotry, that's wise politics and respectful disagreement. I mean, our country was founded on theological disagreements. There were times in which the 13 colonies had a lot of Christian laws. The word Christian doesn't appear in the Constitution for a reason. There was a debate that went on between George Mason and James Madison and others, and now we can't even talk about those same types of debates when it has to do with Islam.
Can non-Muslims help this cause, you think? That's as you say, a theo-political challenge?
Yeah, I think non-Muslims can help lift up Muslim groups and help us create Muslim institutions that can counter the Saudi-fueled, the Wahhabi-fueled groups that right now dominate the public setting, and help us build those networks.
How much of America's Islamic schools and mosques are Saudi influenced today?
Some people have thrown around, I mean, this is why we need to do some hearings and some legitimate studies, is to figure out what is the exact influence of Sharia type mentality, of Islamism. But initially the funding back in the 70s and 80s was around 80%. You know, at this point it's probably much less since 9/11, but you know, it's sort of like a poisonous tree. Once you plant it, it doesn't matter where the water comes from, even if it's from within nearby to the tree. If the seeds came from abroad, it doesn't matter. It's still the Wahhabi ideology. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was a significant percentage. I mean, the North American Islamic Trust owns deed and title to over 50% of mosques in America, and that is an Islamist organization.
And for those who are unfamiliar, what does the Wahhabist ideology try to do with American Muslims?
Well, the Wahhabist ideology basically indoctrinates Muslims that the Islamic State, that even though they follow American law, but when Muslims are a majority, they should put into place a very literal interpretation of Islam, that things that were done at the time of the Prophet need to be completely replicated, that you can't modify them, that any type of modification is what they call a bid'ah, or an invention, and you can't invent new ideas such as the separation of mosque and state, and that is a necessary part of Islam, and I would say that it's not, that we can modernize Islam, and Wahhabism has been one of the biggest threats to not only the West but Muslims in general, because of its autocratic and theocratic positioning.
And finally, what's your concern about Islamists within the government?
You know, I think that the influence of Islamists within the government allows them to drive policy away from criticism of the theopolitical Islam, away from things that may change and help reformers and Islamists. So if you look at, for example, the U.S. Muslim Engagement Project, that was a project that drove the Cairo speech that President Obama gave, and you'll find that it was very soft on reform, very soft on helping dissidents. And ultimately, that project not only was led by Madeleine Albright, but included ISNA and other Islamists within it, and looked at linking the Israeli-Palestinian issue and other things to counterterrorism, which in fact, the only solution to counterterrorism is separation of mosque and state and Muslim reform, and all those other things are distractions. So Islamists in the government are all about creating distractions rather than actually fixing the root cause.
Hesham Islam, the former Undersecretary of Defense, and Stephen Coughlin as an example.
Well, I think Hisham Islam was an assistant to the Undersecretary, and he did a lot of the PR work for him. Yes, I think that case is an example of what happens, of how, you know, Steve's work was dismissed because of complaints from Mr. Islam, and but then ultimately he ended up leaving because it was shown that some of his own bio at the PR work that represented what his history was in Egypt was questionable. So this stuff eventually gets out, the truth gets out, and I think ultimately as America learns about political Islam, it will realize that Islamists are pretty easy to point out and figure out who they are when you start looking at the way they work, the way they operate, and what their ideas are.
Would you think it's fair for the government to start asking questions about radicalism?
Absolutely. I think if you look at any clearances that government officials have, ideology is part of their clearances. So if people are going to have clearances in the Pentagon or elsewhere, their positioning on certain theopolitical ideas of Islam is very important. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about that when it involves clearances. Now, when it involves political activity, there should not be ideological litmus tests. That just needs public scrutiny in the market of ideas.